Liana clutched the thin fabric of her shawl as she stepped out of the carriage, the heat of the midday sun pressing against her skin. The journey had been long, winding through endless stretches of wilderness, far from the bustling city life she had imagined. Her heart pounded with anticipation, yet a sense of unease coiled in her stomach. The promises of luxury and security that Chief Darius had whispered to her parents felt distant now, almost like a fading dream. The house before her was nothing like what she had been led to expect. It was small, weathered by time, its thatched roof sagging slightly under the weight of age. The wooden walls were rough-hewn, bearing the marks of hurried construction. A single dirt path led away from the entrance, disappearing into the thick jungle that surrounded the clearing. There were no grand gates, no sprawling courtyards, no signs of the wealth and status that Chief Darius possessed, only silence. Liana swallowed hard, forcing herself to step forward. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, mingling with the distant aroma of wildflowers. Birds called from the treetops, their songs eerie in the vast emptiness. She turned to the man who had driven her there, a burly servant who avoided her gaze as he lifted her trunk from the carriage. "This is where I will be staying?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. The man hesitated before giving a curt nod. "The chief will visit when he sees fit." Something in his tone sent a chill through her, but before she could press further, he climbed onto the carriage and snapped the reins. Within moments, the dust from the wheels was the only trace he had ever been there. Liana exhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had no choice but to move forward. Chief Darius had insisted that this was only temporary, that she would live here for a while before joining him in the city. "It's for your protection," he had told her. "The city can be overwhelming. You need time to adjust before stepping into the public eye as my wife." But now, standing alone in front of the isolated house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being protected. She was being hidden. Pushing open the wooden door, she stepped inside. The air was cool and stale, carrying the scent of dust and old wood. The room was sparsely furnished, a simple bed pushed against the wall, a wooden table with a single chair, and a small hearth that looked like it hadn't been used in weeks. There were no ornate decorations, no signs of the comfort she had expected. She set her small trunk beside the bed and slowly lowered herself onto the mattress. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on her like a weight. The village where she had grown up had been poor, but it had never felt like this, so stripped of life. Hours passed before she heard footsteps outside. Her breath caught as she rushed to the door, hoping it was Chief Darius, hoping for some explanation. But when she opened it, she found a woman standing at the threshold instead. She was older, her dark skin lined with years of wisdom. A woven basket hung from her arm, filled with small parcels wrapped in cloth. "You must be Liana," the woman said, her voice calm but knowing. Liana nodded hesitantly. "Who are you?" "My name is Elira. I've been sent to bring you supplies." She held out the basket, and Liana took it, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric. Inside she found dried fruit, bread, and a few simple necessities. "Who sent you?" Liana asked. Elira's gaze flickered toward the jungle before settling back on her. "The chief," she said, but something in her tone told Liana there was more. Something unsaid, something deliberately concealed. Elira turned to leave, But before she did, she added softly, "Be careful here, child. Some truths are better left buried." The words sent a shiver down Liana's spine as she stood there, clutching the basket to her chest. The air around her suddenly felt heavier, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. That night, as she lay in the small wooden bed, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, a realization settled deep into her bones. She was not here to adjust. She was here to disappear. The days blurred together in quiet monotony, each one identical to the last. Liana woke with the first light of dawn, the jungle outside still cloaked in mist. The chirping of insects and distant calls of birds were her only companions as she moved through the small, cramped house, trying to keep herself busy. The isolation pressed against her like an unseen force, wrapping around her ribs and making it hard to breathe. She tried to convince herself that she could grow used to this, that it was only temporary, just as Chief Darius had promised. But deep down she knew better. Promises were easy to make, even easier to break. There was no electricity, no running water, only a small stream, a short walk away, where she washed her clothes and filled a clay jug for drinking. The nights were the hardest. Darkness fell quickly in the jungle, swallowing the trees in an inky blackness, so absolute that even the moonlight barely touched the ground. The house creaked in the wind, and the sounds of unseen creatures skittering through the underbrush sent her heart racing. Elira visited every few days, always bringing supplies and little else. She was polite but distant, never lingering longer than necessary. When Liana pressed her with questions, the woman would only shake her head and say, "The chief does what he must." What did that mean? What was so dangerous about the city that she had to be kept here like this? One evening, as she sat on the small porch, staring out at the thick expanse of trees, she caught movement in the distance. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow shifting between the trunks. But then she saw it again. A figure, small, barely visible, standing just at the edge of the clearing. Liana froze. Who else lived out here? As far as she knew, the nearest village was hours away on foot. She had never seen another soul aside from Elira and the occasional messenger who came with word from Chief Darius. She stood, hesitantly taking a step forward. The figure shifted but did not move away. From this distance, she couldn't make out any details, but she couldn't make out any details, but she could tell it was a boy, a child, no older than 10 or 11. "Hello," she called softly. The boy took a step back, vanishing into the trees. Liana's pulse quickened. Who was he? Was he alone out there? She wanted to chase after him, to demand answers, but something held her back. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The next morning, she ventured out, walking the perimeter of the house as if she might find some clue as to who the boy was. The jungle was still, the air thick and humid. She forced herself toward the stream, feeling an unnatural silence pressing down on her. As she knelt to fill her jug, she glanced up, and there he was again, this time closer. The boy stood at the tree line, watching her with dark, cautious eyes. His clothes were ragged, his skin streaked with dirt, but there was something sharp in his gaze. He was not just some lost child. He was waiting. Liana set down her jug slowly. "I won't hurt you," she said carefully, keeping her voice low. The boy didn't respond. He simply stared at her, unmoving, unreadable. 1,000 questions burned on her tongue, but before she could speak again, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Liana exhaled shakily, gripping the edge of the water jug. Who was he? And why did she feel, deep in her gut, that he was the reason she had been sent here? Liana couldn't stop thinking about the boy. His presence lingered in her mind like a whisper in the dark, a question left unanswered. Who was he? Why had he been watching her? And more importantly, why did she feel as though he was just as trapped in this place as she was? Though he was just as trapped in this place as she was. That night, she barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, standing at the edge of the trees, silent and watchful. Was he a ghost of this jungle, or something more? The next morning, determined to find him again, she left the house earlier than usual. The jungle was cool in the early light, the mist still clinging to the undergrowth as she made her way toward the stream. She didn't call out to him this time. She didn't want to startle him. If he was as wary of her as she was curious about him, she needed to be careful. She filled her jug slowly, scanning the tree line, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. Frustration coiled in her chest. Had she imagined him? Was it possible that the isolation was beginning to play tricks on her mind? Just as she was about to give up, she caught movement in her peripheral vision. A flicker of shadow, a rustling of leaves, and then he was there. The boy stepped out from the trees, no more than 10 feet away from her now. Up close, she could see him more clearly. His frame was thin, almost too thin, and his clothes were little more than scraps. His hair was a wild mess of dark curls, his face streaked with dirt. But his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and cautious. Liana held her breath, afraid that if she moved too quickly, he would vanish again. "Who are you?" she asked softly. The boy didn't answer. He just stood there, watching her, as if weighing the risk of speaking. Liana hesitated, then crouched down slowly, trying to make herself seem less threatening. "I'm Liana," she said, voice gentle but firm. "I live in that house over there. I live in that house over there. She hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I wasn't expecting to see anyone else out here." Still, he said nothing. She sighed. "Are you lost?" The boy's expression flickered. Just for a second. Something passed across his face, something unreadable, but undeniably there. And then he shook his head. Liana frowned. If he wasn't lost, then what was he doing here? Before she could ask another question, he turned sharply and ran back into the trees, disappearing as swiftly as he had come. Liana shot to her feet, her pulse hammering. She wanted to follow him. She wanted to chase him down and demand answers, but something in her gut told her that this wasn't a game. Whoever this boy was, he was keeping himself hidden for a reason. But from what? She returned to the house, her mind spinning with questions. When Elira arrived later that day with fresh supplies, Liana saw an opportunity. "Elira," she said carefully, watching the older woman's face. "There's a boy in the jungle." Elira stiffened. It was subtle, just a small, almost imperceptible shift in her posture. But Liana caught it. She pressed. He was watching me. I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't say anything. Do you know who he is? Elira busied herself unpacking the basket she had brought, avoiding Liana's gaze. You shouldn't wander too far, she said instead. The jungle is dangerous. That's not an answer. Elira exhaled, the sound heavy, burdened. Liana, listen to me. There are things in this place you don't understand. Leave the boy alone. Liana's stomach twisted. Why? Elira hesitated. Then finally, she met Liana's gaze. Because asking too many questions here can get you into trouble. The words sent a shiver down Liana's spine. She had the unsettling feeling that she had just stumbled onto something much bigger than she had ever imagined. The unease in Liana's chest only grew after Elira's warning. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way the older woman had spoken them. Clipped, deliberate, carrying the weight of something unsaid. Liana could feel it in the air, in the tension that crackled between them like a distant storm waiting to break. But if Elira thought her vague warning would stop her, she was wrong. Liana had never been one to ignore her instincts, and right now, every fiber of her being was telling her that the boy in the jungle was the key to understanding why she was really here, and why she was being hidden. The next morning, she made up her mind. If Elira and Chief Darius weren't going to give her answers, she would find them herself. She packed a small bag, just a few pieces of dried bread and a water jug, before setting off toward the village. If anyone knew about the boy, it would be the villagers. The journey was long, the path winding and uneven, but Liana pressed on, her thoughts racing. When she finally reached the outskirts of the village, the air smelled of burning wood and roasting food. The people here lived simply. Small mud brick homes lined the dusty road, children ran barefoot, and traders haggled over baskets of fruit and spices. As she walked through the village, she felt their eyes on her. Whispers followed her like shadows, but no one approached. It was clear they knew who she was. She spotted a group of women gathered near a well, their conversation quiet and measured. Taking a deep breath, she approached. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a polite smile. "I'm looking for someone." The women exchanged wary glances. One of them, a tall woman with braided hair and sharp eyes, spoke first. "We don't get many visitors here." "I'm not a visitor," Liana said carefully. "I live in the house past the jungle." Silence. The energy in the group shifted. Some of the women averted their gazes. Others stiffened. She pushed forward. "There's a boy," she said, lowering her voice. "He watches me from the trees. Do you know him?" The tall woman's expression didn't change, but her jaw tensed. Another woman, younger, let out a nervous laugh. "There are many boys in the village," she said quickly. "Maybe you saw one of them." Liana shook her head. "No, he doesn't live here. He's out there, alone." The younger woman paled. The tall one stepped forward. "You should stop asking questions." Liana felt a flicker of irritation. "Why? What is everyone so afraid of?" The tall woman leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. If you value your safety, you won't speak of him again. The warning sent a chill down Liana's spine. Before she could say anything else, she felt a presence behind her. She turned sharply to see a man standing a few feet away. He was younger than she expected, no older than his mid-20s, with dark eyes that held a flicker of recognition. You should come with me, he said quietly. Liana hesitated. She didn't know him, but something about the way he looked at her, serious, almost urgent, told her that if she wanted real answers, she had no other choice. She followed him down a narrow path, away from the main square. When they were far enough from listening ears, he turned to her. You saw Kai, didn't you? Liana's breath caught. Kai? The man nodded. That's his name. Finally, a name. Who is he? She asked, desperate now. The man exhaled. Someone Chief Darius never wanted the world to know existed. Liana's heart pounded. What do you mean? The man hesitated, then said something that changed everything. Kai is his son. Liana felt the words settle over her like a weight pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Kai is his son. She stared at the man in disbelief, her mind scrambling to piece together what she had just heard. The boy in the jungle, the one watching her, the one no one watching her, the one no one wanted to talk about, was Chief Darius's child. Her first instinct was denial. It didn't make sense. If Kai was his son, why was he out there alone, hidden away like a ghost? The man watched her reaction carefully. I see you didn't know, he said quietly, but you do now. Liana swallowed hard. If that's true, then why isn't he with Chief Darius? Why is he? She gestured vaguely toward the jungle, unable to find the right words. The man's jaw tightened. Because he's a secret, one the chief has spent years trying to bury. Liana felt a chill creep down her spine. Why? The man exhaled, glancing over his shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening. You should leave this alone. Liana's frustration flared. I can't do that. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as if he had expected her answer. Come with me. She hesitated, but something about him, the urgency in his voice, the way his eyes flickered with something almost like regret, told her he wasn't leading her into danger. Without another word, she followed him through the village, weaving between narrow alleys until they emerged onto a quieter path leading toward the outskirts. The man finally spoke again. My name is Jonas. Liana held onto the name like a lifeline. How do you know about Kai? I've known him since he was a baby, Jonas said, and I know what happened to his mother. Liana's pulse quickened. His mother? Jonas hesitated before nodding. She was a village girl. Young, beautiful. The chief loved her once, or at least he made her believe he did. His voice darkened. But when she became pregnant, everything changed. Liana felt the pit in her stomach deepen. Jonas continued, his words clipped and heavy. Darius was already on the path to power. He had ambitions, big ones. A child born out of wedlock, with a girl from the village. That would have ruined everything for him. So he made a choice. Liana's throat felt tight. What did he do? Jonas's expression darkened. He abandoned her, told her to disappear, but she refused to be cast aside like that. She fought for her child's right to exist, and for that she paid the price, and for that she paid the price. The world tilted slightly around Liana. She's dead. Jonas nodded, his gaze heavy. She died giving birth to Kai. The village elders took the boy in at first, but it didn't take long for Darius to step in. Liana gripped the fabric of her dress to steady herself. Why didn't he just raise him? Jonas let out a humorless laugh. You think a man like Darius would risk his perfect reputation for a child he never wanted? No, he made sure Kai was kept away, hidden, out of sight, out of mind. His expression hardened. To him, Kai is a stain on his legacy, a reminder of a mistake he refuses to acknowledge. Liana felt anger churn in her chest. That's why he brought me here, she whispered, realization hitting her all at once. That's why he's keeping me away from the city. He didn't want me to know. Jonas gave a small nod. Now you understand. Liana pressed a hand to her forehead, her thoughts racing. Chief Darius had lied to her, to everyone. He had built his life on a foundation of secrets, and now she was caught in the middle of it. She exhaled sharply. Where is Kai now? Jonas's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Liana's head snapped up. She scanned the shadows, but she saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched prickled against her skin. She squared her shoulders. I need to talk to him. Jonas's gaze was wary. And what do you plan to say? Liana didn't know, but she had to find out. The jungle was darker than before, or maybe it only felt that way because Liana now understood what she was walking into. Each step she took felt heavier, like the weight of the truth had settled on her shoulders, pressing her down. Kai was Chief Darius's son, a living secret, and she had been sent here not for protection, but to keep her from discovering him. The realization burned inside her, fueling every cautious step as she moved toward the trees, her heart pounding. Jonas had left her with a warning. Finding Kai won't be the hard part. Convincing him to trust you will be. She intended to try anyway. The thick vines twisted around the trunks, and the damp earth softened her footsteps as she ventured deeper into the underbrush. The sound of distant birds echoed in the canopy above. But beyond that, the jungle was eerily silent. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. She didn't have to wait long. A rustling to her right made her stop. The air around her seemed to shift, and she knew he was here. Slowly, she turned her head, and there he was. Kai stood at the edge of a narrow trail, partially hidden behind the thick foliage. His dark eyes studied her with sharp, measured caution, as if he were trying to determine if she was a threat. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Liana took a careful step forward. I know who you are, she said, her voice steady. Kai tensed, his fingers twitching at his sides, as if preparing to run. She lifted her hands slightly in a gesture of peace. I'm not here to hurt you. I want to talk. Silence stretched between them, thick and unmoving. I don't need to talk to you. His voice was quiet but firm, the words laced with the weight of someone who had been on his own for too long. Liana exhaled. I know about your mother. His expression flickered, just for a second, but she saw it. A flash of something raw, something unguarded. Still, he didn't move. I know what Chief Darius did, she pressed. I know why he's been hiding you. Kai's jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he would bolt into the trees again. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. And what? He asked, voice colder now. You think that means something? You think you can change anything? Liana hesitated, then shook her head. I don't know, she admitted, but I know you don't deserve this. I know you deserve to be seen. Kai let out a humorless laugh. Seen, he gestured at the trees around them. This is all I've ever known. No one has ever wanted me to be seen, least of all him. Liana swallowed hard. Then why do you keep watching me? That caught him off guard. His eyes darted away for a brief moment before snapping back to hers. She took another step forward. You're curious about me, just like I've been curious about you. He said nothing, but he didn't back away. Liana lowered her voice. I don't want to leave you here like this. Kai studied her carefully. Then don't. The words hit her harder than she expected. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't desperation. Liana took a breath. Let me help you. Kai was silent for a long time. Then finally, he gave the smallest of nods. And just like that, everything changed. Kai's nod was small, almost imperceptible. But to Liana, it was everything. It was an opening, a crack in the walls he had spent his entire life building. She didn't want to push too hard, afraid he would retreat again, so she kept her movements slow and deliberate, closing the space between them inch by inch. How long have you been out here? She asked. Kai's gaze flickered toward the trees before settling back on her. Always, he murmured, for as long as I can remember. The words made something tighten in Liana's chest. He had never known anything else. No warm home, no family, no sense of belonging. No sense of belonging, just the jungle, the shadows, and the knowledge that he was unwanted by the man who should have protected him. Who takes care of you? She asked. Kai's jaw twitched slightly. I take care of myself. Liana frowned. Alone? He hesitated before giving a small nod. There was someone once, an old woman. She looked after me when I was younger. She taught me how to survive out here. But his voice trailed off, and something dark passed through his expression. Lana didn't need him to say it. She already knew. She's gone. She exhaled, glancing around the thick jungle surrounding them. Where do you stay? Kai didn't answer right away. His fingers twitched slightly, and Liana recognized it for what it was, hesitation. He was still deciding whether or not to trust her. She softened her voice. I won't tell anyone. I promise. Kai studied her for a long moment, then gave a small tilt of his head. Follow me. Liana's breath caught, but she forced herself to remain steady as she trailed after him. He moved quickly, slipping between the trees with practiced ease. She had to push herself to keep up, ducking under low, hanging branches and stepping over thick roots. Minutes passed before Kai finally slowed. They emerged into a small clearing, hidden deep in the jungle. At the center stood a simple hut, weathered and patched together with whatever materials he could find. It wasn't much, but it was his. Liana's heart clenched. Kai stepped forward, pushing aside a makeshift curtain that served as a door. "This is it," he said flatly. Liana followed him inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. There was a small pile of blankets in the corner, a few scattered belongings, a wooden bowl, a knife, a bundle of dried herbs, a life stripped down to the barest necessities. She turned to Kai, her chest tightening. Kai scoffed, leaning against the wall. "Better." His voice held a bitter edge. "You mean like a father who actually wanted me? A life where I wasn't a secret?" Liana didn't look away. "Yes." Kai stared at her, something unreadable passing through his expression. Then, finally, he exhaled and dropped his gaze. "That's not how the world works." Liana stepped closer. "It doesn't have to be like this forever." Kai's lips pressed into a thin line. "What are you even doing here?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Why do you care?" Liana swallowed hard. "Because I know what it's like to be trapped." Kai's gaze snapped to hers, sharp and searching. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "Chief Darius didn't bring me here to protect me. He brought me here to keep me away from the truth, to keep me from knowing you exist." Kai's fingers curled slightly at his sides. "So why not just leave? Forget you ever saw me." Liana took a slow step forward, "Because that's exactly what he wants me to do." For the first time, something in Kai's expression softened, and in that moment, Liana knew she had just made an ally. Liana had expected Kai to push her away again, to close himself off like he had every other time she had tried to reach him. But he didn't. Instead, he held her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his dark eyes. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was something close, a consideration. Still, she knew that whatever fragile thread of understanding existed between them could break at any moment. Kai exhaled sharply and looked away. "You shouldn't have come here." "I had to," Liana said, stepping closer. "I needed to see it for myself, to see you." Kai's jaw clenched. "And now you have." He gestured toward the doorway. "You should go before it's too late." Liana hesitated. Too late for what? Kai's eyes darkened, and he took a step forward, closing the space between them. "Do you really think he doesn't know you've been asking questions?" His voice was low, edged with something almost like frustration. "Darius has eyes everywhere. You've been here too long, Liana. They're going to come looking for you." A chill ran through her. She had been so focused on finding Kai, on uncovering the truth, that she hadn't stopped to think about what would happen if Chief Darius realized she had learned too much. "He won't do anything to me," she said, forcing confidence into her voice. Kai let out a bitter laugh. "You don't know him like I do." Liana frowned. "Then tell me." Kai turned away, running a hand through his messy curls. He was silent for a long moment before speaking again, his voice quieter now. "I've spent my whole life hiding from him," he admitted. "I used to think that if I stayed out of sight, if I didn't cause problems, he would leave me alone. his fingers curled into fists. But men like him don't just forget, they erase. Liana's stomach tightened. Erase? Kai met her gaze, something sharp and dangerous behind his expression. He doesn't just want me gone, Liana. He wants me to never have existed. The weight of his words settled over her, thick and suffocating. Liana swallowed hard. Then why haven't they come for you? Kai's lips pressed into a thin line. Because I have something he doesn't. Liana's brows furrowed. What do you mean? Kai hesitated before walking over to the corner of the hut. He crouched down, lifting a loose wooden plank from the floor. Beneath it, hidden from sight, was a small, worn leather satchel. He pulled it out and placed it between them. Liana's pulse quickened as Kai carefully unfastened the buckle. Inside, there were letters. Old, yellowed with time. Some were brittle, edges curling from age. Others were newer, their ink still bold. Kai picked one up and handed it to her. Lana's fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter and began to read. Her breath caught in her throat. It was written in a delicate hand, the ink faded but still legible. It was from Kai's mother. Darius, I am begging you, if you have ever cared for me, even for a moment, do not let our son suffer for your ambitions. He is yours, and he deserves to be loved. Do not turn your back on him. Liana's chest ached as she looked up at Kai. She wrote to him. Kai nodded. Over and over and over again, he gestured to the pile of letters. She pleaded with him, begged him to acknowledge me. And do you know what he did? Lana didn't answer. She didn't need to. Kai's voice was flat, emotionless. He never wrote back. Liana clenched the letter in her hands. The cruelty of it made her sick. Kai leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. These letters are proof of everything he did, everything he tried to bury. His eyes locked onto hers. And that's why I'm still alive. Realization dawned on Liana. He's afraid of them. Kai nodded. As long as I have these, I exist. Liana's heart pounded. She had come here searching for answers, but now she had something much more dangerous. She had a reason to fight. And so did Kai. Liana sat in silence, the weight of the letters pressing against her palms. Each word scrawled on the aged paper felt like an echo of a past that had been deliberately erased, a past that Chief Darius had fought to bury. But the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was hidden. Kai watched her carefully, his expression guarded. He had spent years holding on to these letters, keeping them safe like they were his only tether to existence. And maybe they were. You could have run, Liana murmured, still staring at the words written by Kai's mother. Kai scoffed, shaking his head. Run where? I have no name, no place, no one. He gestured around the small hut, his voice tinged with bitter amusement. This is all I've ever had. Liana swallowed hard. But now we have proof. If the village sees these, if the elders see these, they won't be able to ignore it. Kai's jaw tightened. You think they don't already know? That gave her pause. Kai leaned forward, his voice low, steady. The elders have known about me since the day I was born. They were the ones who allowed me to be hidden. They stayed silent when my mother pleaded for help. And you think a few old letters will change their minds now? Lana frowned. They stayed silent because they were afraid of Chief Darius. Kai let out a humorless laugh. And they still are. Lana exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temples. He wasn't wrong. Chief Darius held power over these people, power built on fear, on control. He had convinced them that Kai was a problem best forgotten, but she wasn't ready to give up. What if we make it impossible for them to ignore? She said suddenly. Kai arched an eyebrow. And how do you plan to do that? Liana met his gaze, determination flickering behind her eyes. We take the truth straight to the village, not in whispers, not in secrecy. We force them to see it. Kai stared at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head, a wry smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. You really don't know how to quit, do you? Liana offered a small, defiant smile. Not when I know I'm right. Kai sighed, running a hand through his tangled curls. Even if I agree to this, what makes you think anyone will listen? Liana straightened. Because we won't go alone. Kai frowned. Who else do you think is willing to stand against him? Liana took a deep breath. Jonas? Kai's expression darkened. Jonas is loyal to the village first. He won't risk putting himself in danger. Jonas is the one who told me who you were, Liana countered. If he wanted to protect Darius's secret, he wouldn't have said anything. Kai studied her, his fingers drumming absently against his knee. She could see the conflict in his eyes. The war between caution and the desperate need to be heard. Finally, he sighed. Fine. Let's see if your friend is as brave as you think. A thrill of adrenaline coursed through Liana. This was it, the first real step towards something bigger than both of them. Kai tucked the letters back into their hiding place, fastening the satchel carefully. But if this goes wrong, he warned, his voice quiet but firm, we won't get a second chance. Liana nodded. She knew the risks, but she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. The truth was worth fighting for. And for the first time since arriving in this cursed place, she wasn't fighting alone. The path back to the village felt longer than before, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on Liana's shoulders. The jungle stretched out around them, thick and unrelenting, but she no longer felt suffocated by it. She had spent weeks feeling trapped, like an outsider in a world that wasn't hers. But now, with Kai walking beside her, the fear had settled into something else, determination. Kai moved silently through the underbrush, his steps light and practiced. Liana, on the other hand, had to focus on every step to keep from stumbling over the twisted roots and uneven ground. He hadn't said much since they left his shelter, and she knew better than to push him. He was afraid. Not for himself, she realized, for her. The village was just ahead when Kai suddenly stopped. Liana turned to face him, her brow furrowing. Kai exhaled sharply, glancing toward the tree line as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. Once we do this, there's no going back. I know. He shook his head. No, you don't. You still think this is about justice, about telling the truth and making people listen. His dark eyes met hers, sharp and searching. But the truth doesn't always set you free, Liana. Sometimes it just makes you a target. Liana swallowed hard. She wasn't naive. She knew the danger, knew that Chief Darius wouldn't take this lightly. But she also knew that fear had kept Kai hidden his entire life. "I'd rather be a target than live in silence," she said firmly. Kai's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he exhaled and nodded. Without another word, he stepped forward, leading them into the village. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and earth, and the hum of conversation drifted through the narrow streets. People glanced at them as they passed, their eyes flickering between Liana and the boy walking beside her. The whispers started almost immediately. They knew who he was. They had always known. Jonas hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do." He glanced at Kai once more before turning away, disappearing into the crowd. Liana turned to Kai. His face was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers curled slightly at his sides. "This is happening," she said quietly. Kai nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Liana knew that tonight would change everything, one way or another. The village square was alive with murmurs by the time Liana and Kai arrived. The setting sun cast long shadows over the gathering crowd, and tension clung to the air like the thick humidity of the jungle. The elders sat in their usual places, their expressions unreadable, their aged hands resting on their laps as if they already knew what was coming. Chief Darius stood at the center, dressed in his usual fine robes, his presence alone commanding silence. His dark eyes flickered across the gathered villagers before landing on Liana, and then on Kai. A ripple of shock passed through the crowd, some gasping, others stiffening, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Jonas was waiting for them near the well, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. But Liana saw the way his gaze flickered to Kai, something wary but not unkind settling in his features. "You're really doing this," Jonas said, his voice low. Liana nodded. "Are you with us?" Jonas's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you're asking." Kai stepped forward. "We're asking for the truth." Jonas studied him for a long moment, then glanced at the letters clutched tightly in Liana's hands. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You're going to get yourselves killed." Liana lifted her chin. "Maybe, but at least we won't be running anymore." Jonas cursed under his breath before rubbing a hand over his face. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" Kai's voice was steady. "Would you?" Jonas let out a humorous chuckle. "No, I wouldn't." For the first time, Liana saw it, the shift, the crack in the wall that had kept the village silent for so long. Jonas straightened, his gaze sharp. "The elders are meeting in the square at sundown. If you want them to listen, that's your chance." Liana's pulse quickened. "Then we'll be there." But they believed it. They had always believed it. Liana stepped forward, her grip tightening around the worn leather satchel containing Kai's mother's letters. Jonas was beside her, silent but steady. She could feel Kai's presence just behind her, tense and unmoving. Chief Darius's face betrayed nothing, but his fingers curled slightly at his sides. Liana, he said, his voice smooth, practiced. I had wondered where you'd gone. His words sent a chill down her spine, but she refused to let it show. She lifted her chin. I was learning the truth. A murmur spread through the crowd. Darius's expression remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. And what truth is that? Liana took a deep breath, steadying herself. That you have a son. Silence. The kind that seemed to stretch, thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around the gathered villagers. Darius's lips pressed into a thin line. You don't know what you're talking about. Kai stepped forward then. No longer a shadow lurking behind her, but a presence that could not be ignored. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the square with undeniable strength. You know exactly who I am. The crowd inhaled collectively. Liana could feel their unease, their fear, but she could also feel something else, uncertainty. Darius's gaze flickered just for a second. It was barely noticeable, but Liana saw it, a crack in his carefully constructed armor. This is nonsense, he said, his voice harder now. A boy from the jungle, a wild orphan. You expect me to believe? You don't have to believe it, Liana interrupted, her voice sharp. They do. She turned to the villagers, lifting the satchel. These letters, she said, her voice ringing through the square, were written by Kai's mother. They prove everything. That Chief Darius abandoned them. That he let her Darius abandon them. That he hid his own son to protect himself. The crowd shifted. Nervous glances exchanged. The elders, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward slightly. One of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen too much, spoke first. Is this true? She asked, her voice steady. Darius's fingers twitched. This is slander. Liana's hands shook, but she forced herself to stay strong. She stepped closer. Then prove it, she challenged. Look at him, Chief. Look at your son and tell everyone here that he isn't yours. The silence was deafening. Darius's face hardened. His eyes locked onto Kai's, and for the first time there was no mask, no carefully measured expression, only raw, exposed fury. Kai met his gaze, unwavering. Then, finally, Darius spoke. This boy, he said slowly, voice thick with restrained anger, is a mistake. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Liana felt something inside her snap. She turned to the villagers, her voice rising. Is that the kind of man you follow? A man who abandons his own blood, who lies to you, controls you, keeps secrets from you? The uncertainty in the villagers' faces turned into something else. Doubt. And doubt, Liana knew, was the beginning of change. The elders exchanged glances, their whispered voices too low for her to hear. But she could see it, the shift, the unease creeping into the space where blind loyalty had once been. Darius knew it too. His voice was sharper now, desperate beneath the surface. You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing. Liana stared at him. No, Chief. I think for the first time we do. Darius's hands clenched into fists. Liana knew this wasn't over. Not yet. But the power he had once held, it was slipping through his fingers. The lesson from Liana and Kai's story. Truth has a way of rising, no matter how deeply it is buried. This story is about courage, the courage to question, to fight, and to demand justice, even when the odds are stacked against you. Liana and Kai's journey reminds us that silence is often the greatest weapon of oppression, and breaking that silence is the first step toward freedom. Chief Darius built his power on fear and deception, but in the end, it was honesty that unraveled his control. Lies can only last as long as people believe them. Once the truth is revealed, change becomes inevitable. Kai spent his entire life hidden, convinced that he had no place in the world. But one person's determination to see him, to stand beside him, changed everything. Changed everything. It teaches us that sometimes people just need someone to believe in them. So ask yourself, what truths are you afraid to face? What injustices are left unchallenged in your world? If Liana and Kai could stand up for what's right, so can you. If you enjoyed this story, let me know where you're watching from. Don't forget to hit a like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. See you in the next one.